Alarms tore through the command deck before I even understood what they meant. Every screen around me turned red at the same instant, and the deep hum of the ship changed pitch, the way it does when the reactor pushes past its normal limits. I gripped the edge of my console and looked up at the main display, where a single ship had appeared out of nowhere on our sensors. It should not have been possible. Our detection grid covered this entire sector of space, layered with 3 different scanning systems that had never failed in the 11 years I had served on this vessel. Yet there it was, a small, rough-looking craft, sitting less than 200 units from our formation, as if it had simply stepped out of the void. "Identify that vessel," said Commander Yesh, our fleet leader, her voice tight but controlled. She had commanded ships longer than I had been alive, and I had never heard her sound uncertain before. Today, for the first time, there was a small crack in that calm. The technician beside me, a young officer named Doran, ran the scan 3 times before he answered. "Commander, the ship does not match any registered species in the Concord database. Configuration is crude. Weapon systems are mismatched, like parts taken from different ships entirely. Life signs read as unusual." "Unusual how?" Doran hesitated, which told me more than his words did. Elevated heart rate, elevated breathing, but no signs of fear response in their biological patterns. "If anything, Commander, the crew appears to be calm, almost eager." I remember laughing quietly to myself at that word, eager. In all my years serving in the Yulvex Concord fleet, no crew facing an armed formation of 6 warships had ever been described as eager. Every species we had encountered understood the numbers. When you are outmatched, you retreat, or you signal surrender, or at the very least, you show the universal signs of fear that every scanner in known space is built to detect. Fear was not a weakness. Fear was proof that a mind understood risk. It was the foundation of every peace treaty, every ceasefire, every rule of engagement that had kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart for the last 3 centuries. "Send the standard hailing signal," Commander Yesh ordered. "Full diplomatic protocol. Let them know we outnumber them, and that surrender terms are generous." The signal went out in 11 known trade languages, plus the universal mathematical greeting that even isolated species usually recognized within minutes. We waited. 30 seconds passed, then a full minute. The small ship did not respond, did not slow down, did not turn away. It continued forward, directly toward the heart of our formation, as if 6 warships were nothing more than an inconvenience to be pushed through. "They are not responding to any channel," Doran said, his voice rising slightly. "Commander, our translators show no acknowledgement at all." I had served with Commander Yesh long enough to know her patience was not endless, but she was, above all things, careful. She waited another 30 seconds, watching the strange ship close the distance, before she finally gave the order none of us wanted to hear. "Prepare defensive fire, non-lethal disruption only. I want that ship disabled, not destroyed. We need to understand what we are dealing with." I keyed the weapons array from my station, watching the targeting reticle lock onto the unknown vessel. Standard procedure called for a warning shot first, a burst of energy meant to graze the hull and demonstrate our capability without causing serious damage. It was meant to end most encounters right there, giving the other side a clear, undeniable reason to stop. The warning shot connected. I watched a portion of the enemy hull glow bright with the impact, plating buckling under the force. By every measurement I had ever learned in my training, that ship should have stopped, should have signaled distress, should have turned to retreat while it still had the chance. Instead, it accelerated. "That is not possible," Doran whispered beside me, and for once, I had nothing to say to correct him, because I was thinking the exact same thing. The unknown vessel surged forward, faster than its damaged hull should have allowed, and opened fire on our lead ship. The weapons were crude compared to our own, built from mismatched components that should not have worked together at all, yet they struck with a precision that suggested the crew inside knew exactly what they were doing. Sparks lit up along our lead ship's shielding as the impacts registered on every display around me. "Return fire, full engagement," Commander Yesh ordered, and there was no hesitation in her voice now. Whatever restraint she had been showing was gone. The situation had shifted from a curiosity to a genuine threat, and every instinct in her told her to end it quickly. 6 warships opened fire on a single small craft. In any other encounter in my career, this would have been over within seconds. I had seen fleets 10 times our size retreat from encounters with less firepower directed at them. I had seen entire war fleets from other species surrender the moment their shields dropped below half capacity, because continuing to fight past that point made no logical sense. Every mind we had ever encountered understood that survival mattered more than victory, that there was no point in a battle you could not win. The small ship's shields collapsed within the first 10 seconds. Its hull began to show visible damage, deep gouges and scorch marks spreading across its surface. Sensors showed internal fires breaking out, atmosphere venting from at least 2 sections. Any rational crew, any crew from any species I had ever studied, would have signaled surrender the moment their shields failed. Continuing to fight after that point offered no strategic value. It only guaranteed further damage with no possible benefit. The ship kept firing. "Their shields are gone, Commander. Structural integrity is failing. They should be requesting terms," Doran said, disbelief clear in his voice. "Keep firing," Commander Yesh said, though I noticed something new in her tone now. Not confidence, something closer to concern. I watched the display as the small ship absorbed hit after hit, its hull cracking open in places, visible fire and debris spilling into the vacuum around it. And still it came forward, still its weapons fired, striking our lead ship's shielding again and again, each impact weaker than the last but never stopping entirely. Then something happened that I still find difficult to describe accurately, even now, long after that day. One of the small ship's weapon batteries, clearly damaged beyond effective use, fired a final burst directly into a weak point in our lead ship's shielding, a point that our own tactical analysis would have said was nearly impossible to hit, given the angle and the condition of their targeting systems. The shot connected. Our lead ship's shields failed entirely along one section, and the enemy weapon punched through into the hull itself. Alarms across the entire fleet changed tone as our lead ship reported serious damage, an entire section losing pressure. Several crew members reported missing from their stations. This was not supposed to happen. A single crippled ship, badly outnumbered, was not supposed to land a critical strike against a fully shielded warship 6 times its size. "Belay previous orders," Commander Yesh said, her voice sharp now. "Target their weapon systems directly. End this." We concentrated fire on the small ship's remaining weapon batteries. Within moments, the vessel had gone dark across half its systems, drifting slightly off its previous course, trailing debris and atmosphere into space. By any measure any of us understood, that ship was finished. It had no weapons remaining that our scanners could detect, no shields, and clear structural failure across multiple decks. We held our fire, waiting for the surrender signal that should have come the moment shields failed, let alone after this much damage. Standard protocol dictated a full minute of observation before any further action, giving a defeated enemy the chance to communicate. 30 seconds into that minute, the small ship's remaining engines flared to life, and it turned directly toward our second-largest vessel. "They are attempting to ram," Doran said, his voice climbing in pitch. "Commander, their trajectory shows a direct collision course with the Halvanar." "Evasive maneuvers, now," Commander Yesh ordered. But even as she spoke, I understood the numbers were against us. The small ship had cut its distance too quickly, and our larger vessels were simply not built for the kind of sharp evasive movement that could avoid a collision at this range in time. I watched the display in something close to disbelief as the crippled, burning vessel struck the outer hull of the Halvanar, its remaining structure crumpling on impact, but tearing a deep gash along our ship's side before finally, going still. The silence on the command deck afterward felt heavier than any battle I had experienced before. No one spoke for several seconds. Even Commander Yesh, a woman who had commanded fleets through 3 separate conflicts, sat frozen in her chair, staring at the wreckage now drifting harmlessly between our ships. "Damage report," she finally said, her voice quiet. "Halvanar reports a hull breach along 3 decks. Minor casualties, no critical systems affected," came the reply over the comm. "Lead ship reports moderate damage. Repairs estimated at 2 days. No further threats detected in the area." "And the unknown vessel?" "Completely destroyed, Commander. No life signs remaining. Debris field consistent with total structural failure. I sat back in my chair and looked at the wreckage on the display. Small fragments scattered across the black, and I felt something I had never felt after a victory before. Not relief, not satisfaction at a threat neutralized, something closer to unease, a small cold feeling settling into my chest that I could not fully explain at the time. "Commander," I said, surprising myself by speaking without being asked. "That ship never signaled surrender. Not once. Not even after their shields failed. Not even after we destroyed their weapons. They kept fighting until there was nothing left to fight with." Commander Yesh turned to look at me, and I saw in her expression that she had been thinking the exact same thing. "I know, Vesic. I have commanded ships against a dozen species in my career, and I have never seen anything behave like that. Whatever that crew was, they did not understand the concept of surrender, or they simply chose not to use it." "Do we know what species they were?" She shook her head slowly. "Sensors could not get a clear read before the vessel was destroyed. We will need to recover what remains of the wreckage and send it to intelligence for analysis. I want every fragment of that ship studied. I want to know who built it, and I want to know why its crew fought like that." I did not know it then, sitting on that command deck with the taste of unease still fresh in my mouth. But that single encounter would change the way every species in known space thought about warfare. It would change the way we planned our fleets, the way we trained our soldiers, the way we understood what an enemy was capable of. We had just met, for the first time, a species that the rest of the galaxy would come to know by a single name, spoken sometimes with confusion, sometimes with respect, and eventually, spoken only in careful, quiet tones. Humans. The recovery teams took nearly 6 hours to gather what remained of the wreckage, and I volunteered to oversee the process personally, unable to shake the feeling that I needed to understand what had just happened before I could rest. Most of the ship had been destroyed in the final collision, but a data core survived intact within a reinforced section near what appeared to be the rear of the vessel, along with several fragments of the crew compartment that our engineers were still analyzing when I arrived at the science bay. "The data core is intact but heavily encrypted," said the lead engineer, a calm and thoughtful officer named Trellis, who had worked with strange technology for most of her career. "It will take time to access anything useful, but we have already learned something interesting from the wreckage itself." "Show me," I said. She pulled up an image on the main display, showing a cross-section of the ship's hull. This vessel was not built for this kind of engagement. Look at the weapon mounts. They are welded in place, not designed as part of the original structure. Someone modified this ship extensively before it entered our territory, adding weapons that do not match the hull's original purpose. What was its original purpose? Trellis zoomed in on another section, showing what looked like storage compartments and what our systems identified as agricultural equipment. Based on the internal layout, this ship appears to have originally been built for transport or supply purposes. It was not designed for combat at all. Someone converted it, likely with limited resources, into a fighting vessel. I stared at the image for a long moment, trying to make sense of what she was telling me. "You are saying that ship, the one that fought against 6 of our warships and struck 2 of them before it was destroyed, was never meant to be a warship in the first place?" "That is exactly what I am saying. Whoever built this modified something they had on hand, likely because they had no other option available, and yet it managed to inflict real damage against a properly equipped fleet." She paused, glancing at me with an expression I recognized well, the look of someone who has found something that troubles them deeply, but has not yet found the words to explain why. "Vesic, I have studied ship designs from over 40 different species in my career. I have never seen a crew push equipment this far beyond its intended limits, and still manage to fight effectively. By every standard I know, this ship should have failed long before it reached us. But it did not fail. No, it did not." We stood there together for a moment, looking at the broken remains of a vessel that had, by any reasonable measure, no business surviving as long as it had. I thought about the crew inside, whoever they had been, continuing to fight long after any sensible mind would have stopped. I thought about the calm readings on our sensors, the complete absence of the fear response every other species displayed when facing overwhelming force. "We need to know more about them," I said finally. "Whatever species this is, if there are more of them out there, The Concorde needs to understand what we are dealing with before we encounter another one. Trellis nodded slowly. Command has already reached the same conclusion. A full intelligence review has been ordered. I have heard rumors that this is not the first encounter reported with this species. There have been scattered reports from independent traders and smaller outposts near the edge of Concorde space, describing similar behavior. Ships that do not retreat, crews that do not surrender. Until now, most of those reports were dismissed as exaggeration. They are not exaggerations. No, she agreed quietly. I do not think they are. I left the science bay that evening with more questions than I had arrived with, and a growing sense that whatever we had encountered today was only the smallest piece of something much larger. The galaxy had operated under certain unspoken rules for as long as anyone could remember, rules built on the simple, universal truth that no mind values victory more than its own survival. Every species we had ever encountered understood this, whether they were peaceful traders or hardened warriors. It was the foundation that made diplomacy possible, that made the difference between war and total annihilation. I did not know it then, but that foundation was about to be tested in ways none of us had ever imagined, and the species responsible for that test had only just introduced itself to the wider galaxy. What we had witnessed that day was not an isolated incident, not a single strange encounter to be filed away and forgotten. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself again and again across every future encounter with humanity. A pattern that would eventually force every species in known space to reconsider everything they believed about war, about courage, and about the limits of what a living mind could endure, before it finally stopped. But that understanding would come slowly, through pain, through confusion, and through a series of encounters that grew steadily worse before anyone truly grasped what they were facing. For now, all I had was a wreck, a locked data core, and a cold, unfamiliar feeling that would not leave me, no matter how many times I told myself the danger had passed. It had not passed. It had only just begun. 3 days after the encounter, Command summoned me to a briefing that would change the direction of my career entirely. I had expected a routine debrief, a formality, before returning to my normal duties aboard the fleet. Instead, I found myself standing in a room with senior officers from 3 different branches of the Concorde military, along with 2 civilian intelligence analysts I did not recognize. Officer Vesic, said Admiral Koran, a tall, severe-looking officer whose reputation for caution was well known throughout the fleet. Your report on the encounter has been reviewed extensively. Command believes your observations regarding the enemy crew's behavior are significant enough to warrant further investigation, and your familiarity with the encounter makes you a logical choice to assist. Assist with what, Admiral? We are forming a small team to study this species, drawing on all available data, historical reports, and any intelligence we can gather. You will work alongside our analysts to build a clearer picture of what we are dealing with. Command wants answers before this species is encountered again, and given recent reports, that encounter may come sooner than any of us would like. I straightened slightly, feeling the weight of the assignment settle onto my shoulders. I understand, Admiral. I will do everything I can to help. Good. He gestured to one of the analysts, a quiet, thoughtful-looking officer named Fennec. Show him what we have found so far. Fennec pulled up a display showing a rough map of known space, with several points marked in red, near the edges of Concorde territory. These are all reported encounters with this species over the past several years, gathered from independent traders, small outposts, and a handful of border patrols. Until your encounter, none of these reports were taken seriously by Command, largely because they described behavior that seemed impossible. What kind of behavior? Ships that fought long after logic dictated they should retreat, crews that continued combat operations despite severe injury. In one case, a trading vessel reported a single small craft engaging and disabling 3 separate pirate vessels before finally being destroyed, despite being outgunned from the very start of the encounter. Fennec paused, glancing at me carefully. Officer Vesic, based on everything we have gathered, we believe this species does not possess whatever internal mechanism causes other species to disengage from combat once the odds become clearly unfavorable. In simple terms, they do not seem to know when to stop. I felt that same cold feeling settle into my chest again, the one I had first experienced standing on the command deck 3 days earlier. You are saying this is not unusual behavior for them. This is simply how they fight. That is our current working theory. Yes. And if it is correct, it presents a serious problem for how the Concord has always approached warfare and diplomacy. Fennec's voice remained calm, professional, but I could hear the concern beneath it. Every treaty, every rule of engagement, every diplomatic framework we have ever built assumes that all parties involved value their own survival above continued conflict. If this species does not share that value, in the way we understand it, we have no reliable way to predict how they will behave in any future encounter. Admiral Karun stepped forward, his expression grim. This is why Command has ordered this investigation. We need to understand this species as thoroughly as possible, and we need to do it quickly. Reports suggest their numbers, wherever they come from, are growing, and their territory appears to be expanding. If we do not understand them soon, we may find ourselves facing a much larger version of what you encountered 3 days ago. I looked around the room at the serious faces surrounding me, and I understood then that this was no longer simply a matter of curiosity. This was a matter of survival for the entire Concord, and possibly for every species in known space. Whatever we had witnessed in that encounter was only a small glimpse of something far larger, and it was our job now to understand it before it was too late. Where do we begin? I asked. Fennec pulled up another display, this one showing fragments of data recovered from the destroyed vessel's data core, portions of it now decrypted enough to reveal small pieces of information. We begin here, with what little we have recovered so far, and we begin by trying to understand a species that, by every measure we have ever used to judge a mind's behavior in combat, simply does not behave the way it should. I did not sleep well that night, replaying the images from the encounter over and over in my mind, the calm readings on our sensors, the ship that kept firing long after it had any reasonable chance of survival, the final, desperate collision that had torn open our second-largest vessel's hull. I understood, even then, that we had only seen the smallest fragment of what this species was capable of, and that understanding filled me with a dread I could not fully put into words. The galaxy had rules. Every species understood them, whether spoken or unspoken. Fight when you can win. Retreat when you cannot. Survive above all else. Because a mind that does not survive cannot achieve anything at all. These rules had held for as long as anyone could remember, shaping every war, every peace, every careful balance of power between the many species that called this galaxy home. Humanity, it seemed, had never learned those rules. Or perhaps, more troubling still, they had learned them and simply chosen to ignore them entirely. Either way, the galaxy was about to find out exactly what that meant, and none of us were prepared for the answer. The following weeks passed in a blur of long hours and growing unease, as our small team worked to piece together everything we could learn about this species that seemed to defy every principle of warfare we understood. Fennec led the technical analysis, working alongside Trellis to slowly decrypt the recovered data core, while I focused on gathering and cross-referencing every scattered report of human encounters from across Concord space. The picture that emerged was not a comforting one. "Here," Fennec said one evening, gesturing to a series of translated logs displayed across the main screen in our small analysis room. "This is a partial record recovered from the data core. It appears to be some kind of training manual, though the terminology is difficult to translate precisely." I leaned forward, scanning the text as it scrolled across the display. Much of it was technical, describing weapon systems and tactical procedures in ways that seemed reasonably familiar, despite the unusual phrasing. But certain passages stood out, phrases that our translation system struggled to render with full accuracy, yet whose meaning came through clearly enough to leave me unsettled. "This section here," Fennec continued, highlighting a passage near the middle of the log, describes combat protocol in situations of what they call overwhelming opposition. Our best translation suggests the instruction is not to retreat or surrender when facing superior numbers, but to continue engagement, using whatever resources remain available, for as long as those resources allow. "That confirms what we saw," I said quietly. "They are trained to fight until they simply cannot fight anymore. Not until the situation becomes unfavorable, until it becomes physically impossible. It appears so, yes." Fennec's expression remained carefully neutral, though I could see the concern in his eyes. And this is only a single training document, likely a low-level manual given to junior personnel. If this represents even a baseline expectation for their combat behavior, the implications are significant. Trellis joined us a moment later, carrying a datapad with additional findings from the historical reports I had been compiling. Vesic, I think you should see this. I cross-referenced the reports you gathered with some older records from before the Concorde expanded into this region of space. There are references to a species matching this description going back further than we initially believed. How much further? At least 2 decades, possibly more. There are scattered mentions in old trade logs, mostly dismissed at the time as rumor or exaggeration, describing a species from a distant, isolated system that had apparently fought through what these logs describe as centuries of internal conflict among themselves, before ever making contact with the wider galaxy. She paused, glancing at me with an expression I had come to recognize over the past weeks, the look of someone about to share something deeply troubling. Vesic, if these old reports are accurate, this species did not simply stumble into an understanding of warfare through occasional conflict. They appear to have refined it over an extraordinarily long and difficult history, long before they ever encountered another species at all. I sat back in my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. You are saying they have been fighting each other for centuries, refining this behavior long before they ever knew other species existed. That is what the evidence suggests, yes. The weight of that realization settled over me slowly, like a heavy fog rolling in over still water. Every other species I had ever studied had encountered warfare gradually, learning its costs through contact with neighboring worlds, developing rules of engagement through necessity and shared understanding. Humanity, it seemed, had spent countless generations locked in conflict among themselves, refining their approach to combat long before they ever had another species to measure themselves against. This changes things significantly, I said finally. If their approach to warfare was shaped entirely by their own internal history, without any outside influence, then whatever behavior we observed in that encounter may not be an aberration at all. It may simply be who they are. Fennec nodded slowly. That is precisely the concern Command has raised as well. We are not dealing with a species that occasionally behaves unpredictably in combat. We may be dealing with a species whose entire approach to conflict operates on principles fundamentally different from everything the Concorde has ever encountered before. I thought back to the moment on the command deck, watching that small, crippled ship continue firing, long after any reasonable mind would have stopped, watching it turn toward our second-largest vessel in a final, desperate act that had torn open its hull despite overwhelming odds against success. I had called it strange at the time, an anomaly to be studied and understood. Now, standing in this small analysis room weeks later, surrounded by growing evidence that this behavior was simply how humanity approached every conflict, I understood that we were facing something far more significant than a single strange encounter. We were facing an entirely different understanding of what war meant, held by a species that, unlike every other mind in known space, did not appear to possess whatever internal limit told the rest of us when enough was enough. And somewhere out there, in the vast darkness beyond Concorde space, more of them were waiting, expanding, growing stronger, with every passing year we spent trying to understand a threat that, deep down, I was beginning to suspect we might never fully comprehend at all. The chance to test our growing theories came sooner than any of us expected, and it arrived in a form none of us had anticipated. A routine patrol near the outer edge of Concorde territory intercepted a small human vessel that had drifted far off its expected course, its systems badly damaged, apparently the result of some kind of internal malfunction rather than combat. When our patrol ships approached, they found something unusual. The vessel offered no resistance at all. Its remaining crew member had already sealed themselves into an escape pod, which our patrol recovered without incident. I was pulled from the analysis team almost immediately, once word reached command that a living human had been recovered. Admiral Karun summoned me personally, along with Fennec, to oversee the initial contact and questioning, given our growing familiarity with everything we had learned about this species over the past weeks. This is an extraordinary opportunity, Admiral Karun said as we walked together toward the secure holding area where the human had been placed. We finally have a chance to speak directly with a member of this species, rather than simply studying wreckage and old reports. I want you to lead the initial conversation, Vesic. Your work on this project has been thorough, and Command trusts your judgment. Understood, Admiral. Has the translator been calibrated for their language? As well as it can be, given our limited samples. Their language appears more complex than we initially expected, filled with what our linguists describe as unnecessary redundancy and emotional nuance that complicates direct translation. But it should be functional enough for a basic conversation. We arrived at the holding area a few minutes later, a secure room designed for exactly this kind of situation, separated from the human by a reinforced transparent barrier for safety, though I doubted, given the human's apparently weakened condition, that such precautions were strictly necessary. Still, Command insisted on caution, and after everything we had learned, I found myself agreeing with that caution more than I might have weeks earlier. The human sitting on the other side of the barrier looked smaller than I had expected, though I reminded myself that physical size had nothing to do with the behavior we had witnessed in that first encounter. He appeared to be male, with short dark hair and features marked by fatigue, though his posture remained upright, alert, watching us with an expression that seemed less like fear and more like simple, careful attention.
"My name is Vesic," I said slowly, allowing the translator time to process my words.
I am an officer with the Concord Fleet. You are safe here. We wish only to speak with you. The human watched me for a long moment before responding, his voice calm, measured, carrying none of the tension I might have expected from someone in his situation. Corwin Hale, he said simply. That's my name, if that's what you're asking. Corwin Hale, I repeated carefully, testing the sound of it. Thank you for speaking with us. We recovered you from a damaged vessel. Can you tell us what happened? Engine failure, mostly. Bad luck more than anything else. We were running a supply route out near the border when something in the reactor gave out. Lost most of my crew trying to stabilize it before I finally got the pod launched. He paused, glancing around the small room with an expression of mild curiosity, rather than the distress I would have expected from someone who had just lost people under his command. I take it your patrol found the wreck. We did. I am sorry for the loss of your crew. He nodded slowly, something flickering across his expression that I could not quite identify, gone as quickly as it appeared. Appreciate that. So what happens now? Am I a prisoner or a guest? That has not yet been decided, I admitted honestly. For now, we would like to speak with you, if you are willing. We have questions about your species that we believe you may be able to help us understand. Corwin studied me for a long moment, and I found myself unable to read his expression clearly, unfamiliar as I was with the subtleties of human facial features. All right, he said finally. I don't see much reason to refuse. Ask what you want to ask. Fennec stepped forward slightly, activating a recording device before speaking. We recently encountered a vessel from your species near the edge of our territory. It was significantly outnumbered and outgunned by our fleet. Despite this, the crew continued fighting long after any reasonable chance of victory had passed, ultimately resulting in the destruction of their vessel, along with the loss of all aboard. He paused, watching Corwin's reaction carefully. We are trying to understand why they did not attempt to surrender or retreat once the situation became clearly unfavorable. Something shifted in Corwin's expression then, a kind of quiet understanding settling over his features. Ah, he said softly. That would have been one of the border patrol crews, probably. Small ships, minimal weapons, running defensive routes along contested space. He shook his head slowly. Doesn't surprise me, honestly. It does not surprise you, I repeated, unable to keep a note of disbelief from my voice. They fought a battle they had no reasonable chance of winning, against a force 6 times their size, and continued fighting, even after their weapons and shields had failed entirely. This does not surprise you at all? Corwin met my gaze steadily, and for the first time since our conversation began, I saw something that looked almost like sadness cross his features, though it passed quickly, replaced again by that same calm, measured expression. Look, I understand this probably seems strange to you. From what I've heard about how the rest of you fight wars, I get why this would look unusual. But for us, that's just how it goes. When you're in a fight, you fight until you can't anymore. That's it. That's the whole idea.
But why?
I asked, leaning forward slightly despite myself. Continuing to fight, after all reasonable chance of success has passed, offers no benefit. It only guarantees further loss, further damage, with no possibility of a favorable outcome. Why would any crew choose to continue under those circumstances? Corwin was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully before he answered. I think maybe the difference is in how we think about a fight to begin with, he said slowly. You're asking why we keep going, even when the numbers say we shouldn't. But for us, the numbers were never really the point. Once you're committed to something, you see it through. Not because it makes sense on paper, but because that's what you told yourself you'd do before it ever started. Stopping partway through, just because the odds turn bad, that's not really in most of our heads as an option worth considering. But your own survival, I said, does that not matter to you? Does that not factor into the decision at all? Of course it matters, Corwin said, and something in his voice carried a weight I had not expected. It matters plenty. But there's a difference between valuing your life and organizing your entire response around protecting it above everything else. We've spent a long time learning that the moment you start making decisions purely based on personal survival, you start losing the things that actually matter. The mission, the people counting on you. Whatever it is you were fighting for in the first place. He shrugged slightly. Doesn't mean we don't want to live. Just means living isn't always the top priority once things get moving. I sat back, processing his words carefully, feeling the weight of the concept settling over me slowly. Every species I had ever encountered organized their approach to conflict around the fundamental principle of self-preservation, a principle so universal that it had never occurred to any of us to question whether another mind might genuinely operate differently. Yet here was Corwin Hale, calm and measured, describing an approach to combat that placed something else, something he called commitment, ahead of his own continued existence. This is not merely individual behavior then, Fennec said carefully. This reflects a broader principle within your species as a whole. More or less, yeah, Corwin said. Doesn't mean everyone thinks exactly the same way. Plenty of disagreement about plenty of things. But when it comes to a fight, once you're in it, that's generally the expectation. You see it through, even to the point of your own destruction, I said quietly. Corwin met my gaze again, and this time there was no mistaking the weight behind his expression. Even then, he said simply, that crew you found, they didn't fail because they kept fighting. In our way of thinking, they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They just ran out of ship before they ran out of reasons to keep going. The room fell silent for a long moment after that, none of us quite certain how to respond to something that challenged such a fundamental assumption about the nature of conflict itself. I found myself thinking back to every treaty I had studied, every diplomatic framework built on the shared understanding that all minds valued their own continued existence above the outcome of any single confrontation. Humanity, it seemed, operated according to a different calculation entirely, one that Corwin Hale described with such quiet, matter-of-fact certainty that it left little room for doubt. May I ask you something in return? Corwin said after a moment, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. Of course, I said. What happens to species out here when they run into someone who doesn't stop? I'm guessing this isn't the first time you've had a fight go sideways on you, but based on the way you're all looking at me right now, I'm starting to think this might be new territory. I exchanged a glance with Fennec before answering honestly. It is new to us, yes. Every species we have previously encountered shares a similar understanding of conflict, one that allows for negotiation, for retreat, for surrender, when the situation clearly calls for it. We have built centuries of stability around that shared understanding. Your species appears to operate according to a fundamentally different principle, and we are still working to understand what that means for our future interactions. Corwin considered this for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been genuine concern. I'll be honest with you, that worries me a little, hearing you say that. Not because I think we're looking to cause trouble out here. Most of us just want to live our lives, same as anyone else. But if the rest of the galaxy has never had to deal with someone who doesn't back down easy, I can see how that might lead to some serious misunderstandings down the road. Misunderstandings that have already begun, I said quietly, thinking of the reports Fennec and I had gathered over the past weeks, the growing pattern of encounters that painted an increasingly troubling picture. We have witnessed your species defend contested territory, with a ferocity that no reasonable calculation would suggest was strategically sound. We have found evidence suggesting this behavior stems from a history of conflict among your own people, refined over what appears to be an extraordinarily long period, long before you ever encountered another species at all. Something shifted in Corwin's expression at that, a flicker of what might have been discomfort, quickly suppressed. "You've been doing your homework," he said quietly. "We have needed to," I replied. "Command believes it is essential that we understand your species as thoroughly as possible, given the potential consequences of continued misunderstanding." Corwin was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, something almost like a warning, wrapped carefully in calm, measured words. "I'll tell you something, and I hope you take it the right way. We didn't get here by being the strongest, or the smartest, or having the best technology. Compared to what I've seen of your ships, ours look pretty rough around the edges. What we've got, more than anything else, is that we don't quit. Doesn't matter how bad things get. Doesn't matter how far outmatched we are. That's not a strategy someone taught us because it works well on paper. It's just who we are, all the way down. And you believe this makes your species dangerous," I said, watching him carefully. "I think it makes us unpredictable. To people who've never dealt with it before," Corwin said. "And unpredictable can look a lot like dangerous, especially if nobody takes the time to understand it before things go wrong." I thought about the wreckage I had examined weeks earlier, the crew who had fought until their ship had nothing left to fight with, the training manual that instructed continued engagement, regardless of the odds. I thought about the cold, unfamiliar feeling that had settled into my chest that first day, a feeling I now recognized as the earliest sign of a truth the entire galaxy was only beginning to understand. We had encountered a species that did not share our most fundamental assumption about the nature of conflict, and Corwin Hale, calm and matter-of-fact in his small holding cell, was only the first small piece of a much larger and more troubling picture. Somewhere out there, beyond the edges of Concord territory, an entire species operated according to this same principle, expanding steadily into space that had once seemed secure, carrying with them an approach to warfare that made no rational sense by any standard the rest of the galaxy had ever known. And if what Corwin said was true, if this behavior truly ran all the way down through everything his species valued, then the encounter that had cost us 2 damaged warships was only the smallest possible glimpse of what might be waiting for us in the future. The report I submitted following my conversation with Corwin Hale reached far higher within Concord Command than I had expected, eventually finding its way to a joint council meeting attended by senior officers from every major fleet within the Alliance. I was invited to present my findings personally, a responsibility I accepted with a mixture of pride and growing dread, uncertain whether the council would truly grasp the significance of what we had discovered. The meeting took place in a large circular chamber aboard the Concorde Central Command Station, a place I had only seen in official recordings before that day. Representatives from a dozen different species sat around the room, each bringing their own perspective, their own history, their own understanding of warfare shaped by centuries of careful, measured conflict. I stood at the center of that chamber, presenting everything we had learned, from the initial encounter to Corwin Hale's own words, laid out as clearly and honestly as I could manage. The reaction, when it came, was not what I had hoped for. "With respect, Officer Vesic," said a senior admiral from one of the larger fleets, a stern figure whose species I recognized as one of the Concorde's founding members, "you are asking this council to believe that an entire species has organized itself around a principle that offers no strategic advantage whatsoever. Continuing to fight past the point of reasonable survival serves no purpose. It is simply poor tactical judgment, nothing more. I fail to see why this deserves the level of concern you are suggesting." "Admiral, with respect in return," I said carefully, "the encounter I witnessed personally involved a single, poorly equipped vessel, inflicting serious damage on 2 of our warships, despite being outnumbered and outgunned from the very beginning. This was not poor tactical judgment. This was a crew executing exactly the outcome their training and culture prepared them for. A single encounter proves very little," another representative countered, a calm voice from the Eastern Fleet delegation. "Perhaps this crew was simply desperate, acting outside the normal behavior of their species entirely. We have gathered evidence suggesting this is not an isolated incident. Fennec said, stepping forward beside me to support the presentation. Multiple independent reports from traders and border patrols describe similar behavior across numerous separate encounters, and our conversation with the captured human, Corwin Hale, confirms this reflects a broader cultural principle within his species, not an anomaly limited to a single crew. The chamber fell into a murmur of discussion, voices overlapping as representatives debated among themselves. I watched carefully, hoping to see understanding take hold, but the expressions around the room told a different story. Confusion, skepticism, and in some cases, outright dismissal. "Officer Vesic," said a new voice, calm and authoritative, belonging to a senior fleet commander named Talvorin, whose reputation for aggressive tactical decisions was well known throughout the Concord. "I understand your concerns, and I do not doubt the sincerity of your findings. However, I believe this council is at risk of overestimating a threat based on limited data. This species, by your own account, possesses technology far inferior to our own. Their ships are crude, their weapons mismatched. Regardless of their willingness to continue fighting past reasonable limits, they simply do not possess the capability to pose a serious threat to a properly prepared Concord fleet." "Commander Talvorin," I said, choosing my words carefully, "the danger is not in their technology. It is in the fact that our entire strategic doctrine assumes an enemy will disengage once the odds become clearly unfavorable. If this species does not disengage under those circumstances, our standard tactics may prove far less effective than we expect, regardless of the technological gap between our forces." Talvorin studied me for a long moment, and I saw in his expression the same quiet confidence I had seen in countless senior officers throughout my career, the confidence of someone who had never personally witnessed what I had witnessed on that command deck weeks earlier. "I appreciate your caution, Officer Vesic, but Command has already authorized a response to the growing number of border incidents involving this species. A larger fleet is being assembled under my command, with orders to make contact and, if necessary, demonstrate the full extent of Concord military capability. I believe once this species witnesses genuine overwhelming force, the behavior you have described will resolve itself." A cold feeling settled into my chest, familiar now after everything I had witnessed and learned over the past weeks. "Commander, with respect, I do not believe a larger demonstration of force will produce the outcome you expect. If anything, based on everything we have learned, a larger engagement may simply result in a larger-scale version of what we witnessed previously." "Your concerns are noted, Officer Vesic," Talvorin said, his tone polite but final. "However, Command has made its decision. I trust that your research will prove useful in preparing our forces for whatever we encounter, but I do not believe this council should delay a necessary response based on a single, admittedly unusual incident." The meeting concluded shortly afterward, with Command formally authorizing the assembly of a much larger fleet, one intended to make what Talvorin described as a clear and unmistakable demonstration of the Concord's military strength along the disputed border region where human activity had been increasingly reported. I left that chamber with a growing sense of dread I could not fully shake, certain that everything we had learned about this species pointed toward a very different outcome than the one Command expected. Fennec walked beside me in silence as we made our way back toward our quarters, both of us processing the outcome of the meeting. "They did not listen," he said finally, his voice quiet. "No," I agreed. "They heard the words, but they did not understand what those words meant. Not truly. Do you believe Commander Talvorin's fleet will succeed in ending this?" I thought about Corwin Hale's calm, steady voice, describing a species that did not organize its behavior around personal survival, a species shaped by what he called an extraordinarily long history of internal conflict, refined over generations long before they ever encountered another mind in the wider galaxy. I thought about the crew of that first small vessel, fighting until there was nothing left to fight with, choosing a final collision over any attempt at surrender. "No," I said finally. "I do not believe it will end anything at all. I believe it will only prove, on a much larger scale, everything we have already learned, and I fear the cost of that lesson will be far greater than anyone in that chamber today understands." The fleet assembled over the following month, growing to a size I had rarely seen outside of the largest conflicts in Concord history, nearly 40 warships drawn from 6 different member species. all placed under Commander Talvoran's direct authority. I was assigned to the flagship as an intelligence liaison, given my familiarity with the species we were about to encounter, though my role in the actual planning of the engagement remained limited. Talvoran listened politely to my continued concerns during our journey toward the border region, but I could see in his expression that he had already made up his mind about the outcome, viewing our previous encounter as a small, unfortunate anomaly rather than a genuine warning. We arrived at the disputed border region on a day that began, deceptively, like any other. Sensors detected human activity in the area almost immediately. A modest defensive fleet of perhaps a dozen vessels stationed near what appeared to be a small outpost, clearly established to monitor and protect this section of contested space. Compared to our own assembled force, their numbers seemed almost laughably insufficient, and I watched Talvoran's expression harden with quiet, confident satisfaction as our sensors relayed the size difference across the fleet. 12 vessels, Talvoran said, standing at the center of the command deck, addressing the assembled officers around him. Against 40. This will demonstrate quite clearly the futility of continued aggression along this border. Signal our terms. We offer them the opportunity to withdraw peacefully, in exchange for a formal agreement recognizing Concord authority over this region. The signal went out, translated carefully into the human language our linguists had spent weeks refining. We waited, watching the small human fleet on our sensors, hoping, at least on my part, that reason might prevail before events spiraled beyond anyone's control. The response came quickly, and it was not what Talvoran expected. "Commander," said the communications officer, her voice carrying a note of confusion, "the human fleet has not acknowledged our terms. Instead, they are broadcasting a message directly to our fleet, addressed to all personnel." "Play it," Talvoran said, frowning slightly. A voice filled the command deck, calm and measured, speaking through our translation systems, with a tone that carried no trace of fear, only quiet, unwavering resolve. "This is Fleet Commander Adeline Voss, representing the Defense Force of Meridian Outpost. We have received your terms and we decline. This territory belongs to the people who settled it, and we do not recognize any authority claiming otherwise. If you intend to take this outpost by force, you should understand that we will not withdraw, regardless of the numbers arrayed against us. We would prefer this end peacefully, but we will not surrender this ground." Silence settled over the command deck following that message, broken only by the quiet hum of the ship's systems. I watched Talvoran's expression carefully, searching for any sign that he understood the significance of what he had just heard, but I saw only confusion, followed quickly by irritation. "They understand the numbers involved," Talvoran said finally, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. 12 vessels against 40. This is not a viable defense. Send a final warning, clarifying the consequences of continued refusal." The final warning went out, and once again, the response came in the same calm, unwavering tone, Commander Voss reiterating her position, with no apparent change in her resolve. Talvoran's expression hardened further, and I saw in his eyes the same decision Commander Yesh had made weeks earlier during our own encounter, the decision that conflict, however regrettable, had become unavoidable. "Prepare for engagement," Talvoran ordered. "Full tactical formation. I want this resolved quickly and decisively." I stood near the edge of the command deck, watching the sensor displays as our massive fleet moved into position against the small human defense force, feeling that same cold dread settling into my chest that I had felt weeks earlier, multiplied now by the sheer scale of what was about to unfold. 40 warships against 12. By any reasonable calculation, this should have ended within minutes, the human fleet either destroyed or forced into a hasty, desperate retreat. The engagement began, and within the first few minutes, it became clear that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with our expectations. The human fleet did not attempt to retreat, nor did they simply throw themselves forward in a desperate, disorganized assault, as some officers had predicted. Instead, they fought with a precision and coordination that suggested extensive planning, using the smaller size of their vessels to execute maneuvers our larger, more cumbersome warships struggled to counter effectively. Within the first 10 minutes, 3 of our vessels reported significant damage, their shields failing under concentrated fire from human ships that seemed to know exactly where to strike for maximum effect. "They are targeting our shield generators specifically," reported one of our tactical officers, disbelief clear in his voice. "Commander, this is not the behavior of a fleet simply attempting to survive as long as possible. This is coordinated, deliberate tactical planning." Talvorin's expression, which had begun the engagement with confident satisfaction, shifted steadily toward something closer to alarm as the battle progressed. "Concentrate our fire on their largest vessels. End this quickly." We concentrated our combined firepower on what our sensors identified as the human fleet's command vessel, a modestly sized ship that nonetheless seemed to coordinate the movements of the entire defense force with remarkable efficiency. Within minutes, that vessel had taken severe damage, its shields failing entirely, its hull showing clear signs of structural stress. By every standard we understood, this should have marked the beginning of the end for the human defense. Instead, the ship continued fighting, its remaining weapons concentrating fire with even greater precision, as if the crew aboard had simply adjusted their tactics to compensate for the damage, rather than considering any form of retreat. "Their command vessel's shields are down," reported the tactical officer, his voice climbing with barely restrained disbelief. "Hull integrity failing across multiple sections. They should be requesting terms, Commander. This makes no tactical sense." "Continue firing," Talvorin ordered, though I noticed his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "End this now." The human command vessel took hit after hit, its hull tearing open in places, visible fires breaking out along its length, and still it continued fighting. Still it coordinated the movements of the surrounding fleet, with a precision that seemed impossible, given the damage it had sustained. I watched the display in something close to horror, recognizing the same pattern I had witnessed weeks earlier, now unfolding on a much larger, much more devastating scale. One by one, our vessels began reporting serious damage. A smaller warship near the edge of our formation suffered a critical hit to its reactor core, forcing an emergency evacuation as the ship began to break apart. Another vessel lost most of its weapon systems to a concentrated assault from 3 smaller human ships working in perfect coordination. Through it all, the human fleet continued fighting, refusing to retreat even as their own losses mounted, even as 2 of their smaller vessels were destroyed outright, their crews offering no attempt at surrender before the end. "This is not possible," Talvorin said quietly, staring at the display before him, watching our carefully assembled fleet, 40 warships strong, struggling against a defense force barely a third of our size. "How is this happening?" I stepped forward then, unable to remain silent any longer. "Commander, this is exactly what I attempted to warn the Council about. This species does not disengage when the odds turn unfavorable. They continue fighting with everything available to them, adjusting their tactics as necessary, until either the conflict ends in their favor, or there is simply nothing left to fight with. The numerical advantage we brought to this engagement means far less against an enemy who refuses to acknowledge that advantage as a reason to stop." Talvorin said nothing for a long moment, watching the battle unfold before him with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something close to genuine fear settling into his features for the first time since I had known him. "Casualties," he said finally, his voice quiet. 7 vessels destroyed, Commander. 12 more with significant damage. Estimated crew losses approaching 400 personnel across the fleet. The battle continued for nearly 2 more hours before it finally reached its conclusion, and by the time it ended, our supposedly overwhelming force had lost far more than anyone in that council chamber had believed possible against an enemy less than a third our size. The human fleet, battered and reduced to only 4 remaining functional vessels, had inflicted damage severe enough that Talvorin finally, reluctantly, ordered our own forces to withdraw, rather than risk further losses, in pursuit of an objective that no longer seemed worth the cost. As we retreated from that border region, I stood on the command deck watching the wreckage of our once mighty fleet drift behind us, and I understood, with a clarity that settled deep into my bones, that everything we had learned about this species was only the smallest beginning of a much larger reckoning still to come. We had brought overwhelming force to a small, contested border outpost, expecting a quick and decisive resolution. Instead, we had learned, in the most costly way possible, that overwhelming force meant very little against an enemy who simply did not know how to stop. News of the battle at Meridian Outpost spread quickly through Concord space, and within weeks, Every major fleet command across the Alliance had received detailed reports of what had happened when 40 warships encountered 12 human vessels along a contested border. The reaction across the galaxy was not what I expected. I had anticipated anger, perhaps calls for an even larger retaliatory force, but instead, what spread through the Concord was something closer to genuine unease, a quiet, growing recognition that everything we understood about warfare might need to be reconsidered entirely. I was recalled to the Central Command Station within a month of the battle, this time not simply to present findings to a skeptical council, but to help lead a much larger effort aimed at understanding humanity thoroughly before any further engagement was considered. Commander Talvoran, humbled by the losses at Meridian, had become one of the strongest advocates for this new approach, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful, measured caution that I found, in some ways, more unsettling than his previous certainty had been. "Officer Vesic," he said, greeting me personally as I arrived at the station, something I had not expected given our previous disagreements. "I owe you an apology. I dismissed your warnings too easily, and the cost of that mistake was far higher than I anticipated. I would like your help now in ensuring the Concord understands this species properly, before we make any further decisions regarding our approach to their territory." "There is no need for apology, Commander," I said honestly. "I understand why the Council was skeptical. What we learned that day challenges assumptions the Concord has held for centuries. It would have been strange if everyone accepted it immediately, without seeing the proof for themselves." "Perhaps," Talvoran said quietly, "though I fear the proof came at a terrible cost." He gestured for me to follow him toward the central briefing chamber, where representatives from every member species of the Concord had gathered once again, this time with a very different atmosphere than the skepticism I had encountered during my first presentation. "The Council has requested a full report, drawing on everything gathered since Meridian, including additional intelligence recovered from that engagement, and further conversations with Corwin Hale, who has remained cooperative throughout his time in our custody." We entered the chamber together, and I noticed immediately how different the mood felt compared to my previous appearance before this council. Where I had once faced skepticism and quiet dismissal, I now saw careful, attentive expressions across every delegation present, representatives leaning forward slightly, as Fennec and I began our presentation, drawing together everything we had learned over the past several months. "The engagement at Meridian Outpost confirms everything our earlier research suggested," I said, standing at the center of the chamber, addressing the assembled representatives directly. "Humanity does not organize its approach to conflict around the principle of self-preservation, in the way every other species in this chamber does. Their crews continue fighting regardless of numerical disadvantage, regardless of sustained damage, until either the conflict resolves in their favor, or there is genuinely nothing left with which to continue. This is not desperation. It is not poor tactical judgment. It is, according to Corwin Hale's own testimony, a fundamental principle woven into their culture, refined over what appears to be an extraordinarily long history of internal conflict among their own people, long before they ever encountered another species in the wider galaxy." A representative from one of the smaller member species, a delegation that had remained largely quiet during my previous presentation, raised a question that struck at the heart of everything the Council now needed to consider. "Officer Vesic, if this species truly does not disengage from conflict based on unfavorable odds, how does the Concord approach any future interaction with them? Our entire diplomatic framework, our treaties, our rules of engagement, all of it assumes a shared understanding that no rational mind continues a conflict it cannot win. If that assumption no longer holds, what framework remains for us to build upon?" I had asked myself this exact question countless times over the preceding months, and I offered the Council the most honest answer I could provide. I believe the framework must change entirely, rather than attempting to fit this species into assumptions that clearly do not apply to them. We cannot rely on the threat of overwhelming force to compel a peaceful resolution, because this species does not calculate the value of continued resistance, the way every other species in this chamber does. Instead, I believe our approach must shift toward genuine diplomacy, built on mutual respect and clearly defined boundaries, rather than any assumption that we can simply demonstrate superior strength and expect capitulation in response. "You are suggesting negotiation as equals," said another representative, an older delegate whose species had been founding members of the Concord for centuries. rather than negotiation from a position of clear superiority. I am suggesting that the position of clear superiority we believed we held may not exist in the way we previously understood it, I said carefully. Our fleet at Meridian possessed vastly greater numbers, and by most measures, superior technology. Yet the outcome of that engagement demonstrated that numerical and technological advantage means far less when facing an opponent who simply does not recognize those advantages as sufficient reason to stop fighting. If we wish to avoid further costly conflicts with this species, I believe we must approach them not from a position of assumed dominance, but from a position of careful, honest negotiation, treating them as a power whose capabilities we do not yet fully understand, rather than one we can simply overwhelm. The chamber fell into quiet discussion following my statement, representatives conferring among themselves in low voices, weighing the implications of what I had presented against everything the Concord had built over centuries of careful, measured diplomacy among species that all shared a fundamental understanding of when conflict should end. I stood at the center of that discussion, watching the weight of this new understanding slowly settle over the assembled delegations, and I felt, for the first time since that first encounter months earlier, a small measure of hope that perhaps this council had finally begun to grasp the true nature of what we were facing. Commander Talvoran stepped forward once the discussion quieted, addressing the council with a tone far different from the confident authority he had carried during our first meeting. I have seen firsthand what happens when we approach this species with the assumption that overwhelming force guarantees a favorable outcome. I lost 7 vessels and hundreds of personnel learning that lesson, and I do not believe the Concord can afford to repeat that mistake on a larger scale. I recommend this council formally adopt Officer Vesik's proposed approach, establishing a diplomatic mission aimed at genuine, mutual negotiation with humanity, rather than any further attempt at demonstrating military superiority. The Council's decision, when it finally came weeks later, marked a turning point not only in the Concord's relationship with humanity, but in how every species within the Alliance understood the nature of conflict itself. A formal diplomatic mission was established, led not by military officers seeking to demonstrate strength, but by careful negotiators tasked with building genuine understanding between our peoples. I was assigned to that mission personally, given my extensive familiarity with the species we would be engaging, and Corwin Hale, after months of cooperative conversation, agreed to serve as an advisor to our team, offering insight that proved invaluable throughout the difficult process that followed. The negotiations themselves stretched across nearly a year, filled with moments of genuine progress, alongside moments of significant tension, as both sides worked to build a framework of understanding neither had previously needed to consider. I met, over the course of that year, with numerous human representatives, including Commander Adeline Voss herself, the very officer whose calm, unwavering message had preceded the battle at Meridian Outpost. She proved, much like Corwin Hale, to be measured and thoughtful in conversation, carrying none of the aggression I had once expected from a species capable of such relentless combat behavior. "You seem surprised," she said to me during one of our early meetings, noticing my careful observation of her demeanor throughout our discussions. "I imagine the reports you have received painted us as something closer to unstoppable monsters, given what happened at Meridian." I confess, I did not know what to expect, I admitted honestly. Everything we witnessed in combat suggested a species defined entirely by relentless aggression, yet in conversation, you and Corwin Hale both display a calm, thoughtful demeanor that seems almost at odds with what we observed on the battlefield. Commander Voss considered this for a long moment before responding. "I think that is perhaps the piece your people have struggled most to understand about us. Fighting until the end is not the same as seeking conflict for its own sake. Most of us would far prefer peace, genuinely and sincerely. But once conflict becomes unavoidable, we do not organize our response around calculating the safest possible outcome for ourselves. We simply commit fully to whatever the situation requires, for as long as it takes to resolve." She paused, studying me carefully. "I understand this looks frightening from the outside. I imagine, in your position, it would look the same to me, but I hope, over time, your people come to understand that this does not make us your enemy. It simply means we are not a species you can hope to intimidate into submission, and any lasting peace between us will need to be built on genuine respect, rather than assumed superiority." Her words stayed with me long after that meeting concluded, echoing through countless subsequent conversations, as our negotiations slowly, carefully, built toward a lasting framework of peace between humanity and the Concord. By the end of that difficult year, a formal treaty had been established, one built not on the old assumptions of overwhelming force and calculated capitulation, but on genuine mutual respect between two very different understandings of what conflict meant and how it should be approached. I think back often, even now, years after that first encounter on the command deck, to the cold, unfamiliar feeling that had settled into my chest as I watched that small, crippled human vessel continue fighting, long after any reasonable mind would have stopped. At the time, I understood it only as confusion, a simple failure to comprehend behavior that made no logical sense, according to everything I had ever learned about warfare and survival. I understand now that what I felt that day was something closer to the first quiet recognition of a truth that would eventually reshape the entire galaxy's understanding of conflict itself. Every species within the Concord had built its approach to warfare, to diplomacy, to the delicate balance of power that had kept the galaxy stable for centuries, around a single shared assumption that all rational minds valued their own continued survival above the pursuit of any single conflict, and that this shared value created a natural limit to how far any confrontation could escalate before reason ultimately prevailed. Humanity, we discovered, simply did not share that assumption in the way the rest of us understood it. They valued survival, certainly, but they organized their response to conflict around something different entirely, a commitment that ran deeper than calculated self-preservation, refined over countless generations of internal struggle, long before they ever encountered another mind among the stars. This did not make them monsters, as some within the Concord initially feared. It did not make them villains seeking conquest for its own sake, as others suggested during those early, uncertain months. It simply made them different, shaped by a history none of us had witnessed, carrying an approach to conflict that the rest of the galaxy had never needed to consider before their arrival among us. The peace we eventually built with humanity has held now for several years, carefully maintained through continued diplomatic effort and a growing, genuine respect between our peoples. Trade routes have opened between our territories. Cultural exchange has flourished in ways I never expected during those early, tense months following our first encounter, and I have come to know both Corwin Hale and Commander Voss, not merely as subjects of study, but as genuine colleagues, and in time, something close to friends. Yet even now, sitting in my quarters aboard the very ship where this entire story began all those years ago, I find myself remembering that first moment on the command deck, watching a single small vessel refuse to stop fighting long after every reasonable calculation suggested it should. I remember the cold feeling that settled into my chest that day, and I understand now what that feeling truly represented. It was the first quiet recognition of a lesson the entire galaxy would eventually learn, one way or another, about the species that had arrived unannounced at our borders, carrying within them a simple, unshakable truth that no amount of overwhelming force could ever hope to change. Humanity does not calculate the safest possible ending to a fight. They do not carry within them whatever quiet mechanism tells every other mind in this galaxy when enough has become enough. Once committed, they continue, drawing on whatever remains available to them, for as long as anything remains to draw upon at all. We learned that lesson at great cost, through wreckage and loss, and the slow, painful realization that everything we once understood about warfare no longer applied to the species now sharing the stars alongside us. But we learned it, eventually, and in learning it, we built something far more valuable than the temporary satisfaction of a quick, decisive victory. We built genuine understanding, and from that understanding, a lasting peace that neither side could have achieved through force alone. The galaxy is a different place now than it was before that first small ship appeared on our sensors all those years ago. Every fleet commander within the Concord understands now that some battles are not won through numbers or technology, but through a willingness to simply keep going, past every point where reason suggests a rational mind should stop. Humanity taught us that lesson, not through malice or conquest, but simply by being exactly who they had always been, a species forged through countless generations of struggle, carrying within them a determination that the rest of the galaxy had never before encountered, and, I suspect, will never fully forget.